Hello, my name's Chris O'Connell. I'm the Heritage Manager at Scottish Canals, and welcome to the Caledonian Canal. We're here at Corpack, which is the western entrance to the canal, and we're going to take you on a journey through time and along the length of the canal and look at some of the marvellous features and landscape that the canal runs through. In 1802, Thomas Telford was appointed by then government under George III to find a route through the Great Glen to survey the canal, to connect the east to the west, bring employment and trade and open up the country. And it wasn't just the canal, it was a whole series of infrastructure. It was new roads and new bridges that Thomas Telford had proposed. And what Telford said was, he said this will help to staunch the flow of emigres from Scotland. Remember, this is just after the Highland clearances. Lots of Scots were moving to Canada or the Americas. And the other proponents, the Royal Navy, they were at war with Napoleon in the Peninsular Wars, and there was a lot of French frigates that were patrolling the waters around Scotland. So that was the reason for building the canal. It got off to a bit of a shaky start, but being the eminent Scottish engineer he was, he did, and it's been built, and it's here, and it's beautiful, and it's in the shadow of Ben Nevis, and it's a very special place. Come and join me on an exciting trip through history along the canals, looking at some of the marvellous feats of engineering that Thomas Telford and Hugh Baird built, learning about the wonders that the Caledonian and Union Canals hold in their history. Let me introduce you to a friend of mine just behind me here. It's one of 3 pepper pot lighthouses on the canal. This one was built in 1912, and it signals boats, it brings boats safely into the entrance of the canal. So here we are inside the pepper pot, lovely concave roof at the top. You can just make out the lights there which flash red and green. It's to get the boats into the canal, provide safe passage, and yeah, an unusual structure. Here we are at Neptune's Staircase, a series of 8 locks that was built in 1811. It rises 64 feet. You've got to agree that although we have many stunning locations along the canal network, this really is the jewel in the crown. And basically locks, I guess you want to know what a lock is for, it's a way of getting a boat up or down a hill. You can see behind me boats are going to start to move into the lock. We'll fill the lock, raises the boats, and they'll sail out into the next lock and so on till they reach the top. You may have noticed this wonderful Georgian house behind me with the bay windows. That's actually a Thomas Telford house where the great man himself stayed while he was planning the feat of engineering that is Neptune's Staircase. We've just left Neptune's Staircase heading for Gairlochie, and we've stopped at the Loy sluices. These peculiar objects behind me are the mechanisms that control the sluice gates that are under the water. Sluices are a vital part of a canal's water management processes. If, for instance, there was a storm or the level of the canal would rise too much, we can let out in a managed way a certain amount of water and bring the canal back down to its operating level. So behind me now, this marvellous piece of Georgian engineering is under the sluices that we just looked at. If you look carefully, you can make out 3 of the sluice gates on the back wall, which, when opened, let the water out of the canal, which then makes its way down into this pond and eventually dissipates through the natural watercourses and away from the canal. Well, here we are at the next stage of our little journey up the Caledonian Canal. We're at Moy Bridge, an original and probably the oldest bridge on the canal. It's a swing bridge, and it basically serves one farmer whose land was dissected by the canal when it was built, and to enable him to get from one side to the other, this swing bridge was built. You can see at either end there's two bollards, not unlike the Loy bollards that we saw at the sluices. And again, it's a hand cranked mechanism. You put a crank handle in there, the bridge keeper turns it, it swings the bridge in one direction, he gets in a small dinghy, rows across the canal, and to close the bridge he does the same operation on the other side, and then brings himself back to his little bothy for the next time a boat needs to pass through. A quirky little piece of engineering. Well, we continue our journey, and here we are at Gairlochie Swing Bridge. The swing bridge is actually built in 1935 by Arrell and Son. They were famous engineers and built bridges and other pieces of infrastructure all over the canal network. It's also had some famous visitors, including the Royal Commandos in the Second World War, who used the whole area as a training grounds. And Queen Elizabeth and her husband traversed the bridge in 1958. So the bridge is a swing bridge, as I say, it let the boat traffic through. So here we are at Gairlochie Top Locks. They were put in 1844 to 1846. It was a response to an earlier flood of 1834. Behind us is Loch Lockie. It has a big catchment area of rainfall. And as I say, in 1834, the original locks overtopped. As a response to that, these new locks were put in. It's a new gate. I think they weighed something like 25 or 30 tons each. They're beasts of a gate. And as I say, it's all about flood protection. And we'll explain, or we'll explore that flooding issue a little more when we go on to Caledonian Weir. At the same time that we extended the height of the top lock, we also built this flood protection bund to protect the farmers' fields and the low-lying ground to the left of me. What we're looking at here is the base of the original beacon that lit the way into the canal from Loch Lockie behind me. On top of this beacon was a lamp, an oil-fired lamp called an Anghard lamp. It was a series of reflective glass mirrors with a wick, oil-fired, lit up. It was made by a Wilkins and Son of London, and we think it's probably about the mid-1800s. As I say, it was latterly replaced by the Pepperpot Lighthouse of a similar form to the one we've seen in Corpack, although this one dates from 1932. So shall we take a look at the Pepperpot Lighthouse and the view across Loch Lockie? Here we are on the shores of Loch Lockie, and behind us is the Gairlochie Pepperpot Lighthouse. It's the one of the three that we have on the canals. We've already visited the one at Corpack, and we'll later in the day see the one at Fort Augustus. When you see a view like this, it really brings it home what Thomas Telford faced when he's bringing a canal through the Great Glen. You really understand what a feat of magnificent engineering Thomas Telford undertook. But now let's make our way to Caledonian Weir. The Great Flood of 1849, which washed away Caledonian Weir, also washed away the original stone bridge over the River Oik. This bridge, this lovely suspension bridge, replaced that 5 years later. So here we are at Caledonian Weir. We have Loch Oik behind us and Fort Augustus in that direction. I've stopped here because there's a bit of an interesting history about this weir. In 1849, the original weir was washed away in the Great Flood. It was rebuilt, and again in 2015, because of snow melt, the levels of Loch Oik, and a storm, that weir was also washed away. What we're standing on now is the new weir that was constructed in 2015. Although we haven't rebuilt the weir as it was historically, we have used sheet piling on either side, and you can see the metal piles in the ground, and it's filled with a concrete core rather than a rubble core. This structure is what's called an overflow weir. It's quite simple. If the water in the canal reaches a certain height, it will overflow, overtop this weir and discharge into the River Oik until the canal levels drop to their normal operating levels. And now on to Fort Augustus. So here we've arrived at Fort Augustus. Behind me is the lock flight, which takes you down to the most famous lock in Scotland, Loch Ness. If you look at these locks, you can see this hydraulic mechanism below the walkway. That's how the locks are currently operated. But when they were first constructed, they were manually operated. And what I'm sitting on here is called a capstan. It goes down 8 feet. It would have had a chain wrapped round it. You put in 4 oars, about 6 foot long. You'd have 4 men or 4 women potentially to turn this, keep turning, and slowly pull the gate open. When you wanted to close the gate, you did the same, but on the opposite side. So there's quite a lot of historic infrastructure still surviving here. This is why its setting, this is why it's an attraction to so many tourists. But the tourist industry really kicked off in 1873 when Her Royal Highness Queen Victoria decided to take a trip up the canal, and it became known as the Royal Route, after which people flocked to follow in the footsteps of Her Majesty. This is the last of the 3 pepper pots on the Caledonian Canal at Fort Augustus, and if you look carefully in the distance you can see sailboats making their way to the entrance of the canal, ready to take their journey, their navigation up the lock flight. We've stopped here at Merton Basin not just to admire all the beautiful yachts behind me, but to explore the canal's history in the First World War. The American Navy set up a naval base, Naval Base 18, in the former Glenalbyn distillery. Now that building's long gone, but behind me you can see a crane, a derrick, that was used to load the mines onto barges, which were then sent along the canal, up through the Beauly of Firth, up to the North Sea to create a continuous mine barrage called the Northern Barrage that ran from the Orkneys to Norway. Now I'm just going to have a look at this crane behind me now. If you'd like to come and have a look. You can see the pulley system. You can see the hook at the end. Would have picked up a mine, swiveled it around, dropped it into the barge taken up through the canal. Who should live in a house like this? Well, it's our old friend Thomas Telford. The house was bought by the commissioners of the Caledonian Canal, and Thomas lived in the top flat whilst he oversaw the works at Clachnahary. We're nearly at the end of our journey at Clachnahary, the original sea lock, and I want you to cast your mind back to Corpac. If you remember that Thomas Telford's issue at Corpac was that the underlying geology was hard granite which he had to blast and cut and make his way through. Here it was quite different. It was shifting sands and soft mud. Thomas Telford overcome this issue by importing an awful lot of quarry material, dumping it onto the bottom of the lock here, building it up, letting it sink, putting more material on top, and until he got the right level, then he excavated the canal through this build-up of material. You can see the original workshops which were built to service the canal, and in front of me, and where we'll be going to finish our journey, is the end of the canal looking out over the Beauly of Firth. I'm just crossing the railway line that was constructed in 1862 with the replacement iron bridge, swing bridge in 1909. We've come to the end of our journey along Scottish Canal's Caledonian Canal, and what a way to end with the view of the Beauly Firth behind us, bathed in sunshine. And if you've enjoyed it as much as I have, then you'll have to come and experience the Caledonian Canal yourself. The story doesn't end here. We'll head south to embark on a journey along the Union Canal. The Union Canal was built in 1822 and ran from Edinburgh in the east to Falkirk in the west. The location we stood at now is the connection between the Union Canal and the Forth and Clyde Canal. Now, why did we need that connection? Well, the Union Canal's purpose was it was built to transport coal for domestic use into Edinburgh. The only way it could get that coal was by joining the Forth and Clyde Canal, which had access to the Central Belt coalfields. The location we're at now had a series of 11 locks, And we're going to take a little walk down those and discover what was left of those. They were infilled in the 1930s, but you can see elements poking out through the vegetation. Come and join me on an exciting trip along the canal, looking at some of the marvellous feats of engineering that Hugh Baird built and celebrate over 200 years of history. So we can just see here the top courses of one of the locks. As you can see, you can just make out the masonry walls here. There's a couple of courses exposed. As the boats come down, to allow boats coming up, there would have been these basins off to the side, which again are infilled. It would take a whole day to get your boat down or up the canal. Fortunately, if you're heading down the way, there's a pub called the Union Inn where you could stop for a refreshment while the barge was brought down by the horses. So this, as I say, is all of that's left of the original connection between the Union Canal and the Forth and Clyde Canal. The connection now, of course, is the Falkirk Wheel. Now we're going to head east towards the Falkirk Tunnel. Here we are at the western entrance of the Falkirk Tunnel. A 630 metre tunnel hewn out of the bare rock with pickaxes and dynamite, built by the navvies. You may ask why we have a tunnel. Well, the reason being was that the landowner at the time, William Forbes of Callander, petitioned Parliament because he didn't want a canal crossing his landed estate and spoiling his views. Hence the tunnel. Follow me and we'll take a look. I'm just inside the entrance of the tunnel now, and if you look behind me on the ceiling, you can see that bare rock that the navvies had to break their way through, either with dynamite or with pickaxes. I can only imagine that must have been very, very hard work. This is the West Quarter in Falkirk, and this rather unassuming swing bridge that no longer swings has a great story behind it that I'd like to share. It's known as the Nobel's Bridge, or Nobel's Swing Bridge, after Sir Alfred Nobel, famous for the Peace Prize, the prize in physics, the prize in maths. But Nobel was also famous for something else. I'll give you a clue. Kaboom! He was famous for making explosives. He invented dynamite. And in 1876, he set up a factory here to make detonators, mercury fulminate detonators. It started small with just a few people in the factory, but by the Second World War, it was employing over 1,700 people and turning out 73 million detonators. And this bridge used to service both sides of the factory. So when you do walk past, remember this is a nod to the diversity of the industries that sprang up on the Union Canal. Next stop, a little secret hideaway called Causeway End Basin. I'm at Causeway End Basin on the Union Canal. In the 1840s, the basin was a hub of industrial activity, with railways and rail links coming into the basin, unloading coal from the North Lanarkshire coal mines, the coal being taken into Edinburgh or to Falkirk to service the industries along the canal. But as you can see now, it's a quiet, tranquil haven for residential boaters. And there are some archaeological remains of the railway left, of course, and just below me here, just where my foot is one of the rail tracks. And what wonder is this, I hear you ask? Well, it's Scotland's longest aqueduct. It's the Avon Aqueduct. It's 250 metres long, 26 metres high, 7 metres across. The genius of Hugh Baird, who designed it, however, was to make it lightweight, to make the whole structure light and easy to build. He built an iron trough, like a bath, and that holds the water. The aqueduct obviously navigates the River Avon below, and if you follow it, we shall get to Linlithgow, which is our next stop on our journey. Welcome to Mance Road Basin, probably the best preserved of the historic basins on the canal. When the canal was opened, the coal would come into Linlithgow, it would be unloaded here, and all the local farm produce loaded onto the boats for distribution in and around the central belt. But also, because the canals were so successful, it was taking trade off the local turnpike roads. The turnpike roads were roads that were run by the local councils, and they would tax travel along the road. And because people were now using the canal, the local councils taxed the proprietors of the canal. And you can see behind me, you'll just see a rooftop behind me, that was the tax collector's house. It's now also home to the Lithgow Union Canal Society, or LUX. They were founded in the mid-1970s, a group of local enthusiasts who really pitched in and started to clear out the basin, bought a boat, started to do work along the canal, and instigated a grassroots movement that culminated eventually in the reopening of the lowland canals in the millennium. Okay, we're standing on embankment 78, just outside of Linlithgow. 2 years ago in August, almost to the day, there was an almighty storm hit the central belt. So much rainfall fell in one evening, a surge of water. The water found a weak spot in the embankment and punctured a hole about this length, 25 metres. All the water washing down into Haining Woods there, all the fish in the water washing down into the woods. We're in an emergency situation. The crews are out, they dam off the canal in that direction, they dam off the canal in that direction to staunch the water. Fish rescue teams are in, literally taking buckets of thousands of fish up, putting them back behind the dam. It was an alarming event, no doubt, but we've solved it. They've created a new embankment reinforced with metal sheet piles that are driven into the canal. And on this side, or where I'm stood, they've lowered the towpath a little bit to make it what's called an overflow weir. So if the water in the canal should get above operational levels, it can slowly wash over here and its energy is dissipated by this rock armour. But that flood, that storm not only knocked out this embankment, but it damaged some of our weirs and our culverts. And to future-proof or to build resilience into the canal, we've had to upgrade some of those historic weirs with new concrete modular weirs that could cope with this excessive water if it should happen again, and hopefully it doesn't. We're at Ratho Basin. I wanted to point out that here we've talked a lot about coal being transported along the canals, but actually canals also run a passenger service called the Swift boats. And somewhere in that vegetation, we can't find the stone at the minute because it's so overgrown, is a staging post. Passengers would line up like a bus stop, buy a ticket and take their journey into either Edinburgh or to Glasgow. It was certainly quicker than using the roads at the time, but perhaps not as quick as our modern day form of transport, as it would take you a few hours to get into Edinburgh and another 4 or 5 hours to get into Glasgow. Also at Ratho, we see behind me the famous Bridge Inn. It's been servicing the local community for forever and a day since the canal opened. But interestingly, the canals, we've talked a lot about the heritage, but the canals aren't something that are just preserved in aspic. They are functioning, they're operating, they're live. People live on them, people work on them, people have employment and gainful employment from them as well. And just to my left you can see a new development, the Ratho Marina, built a few years back, full of residential boats, beautiful waterfront location. It's encouraging to see that life being brought into the canals. Now, onwards towards Edinburgh City. We've come to the end of our journey. We're in the city of Edinburgh at a place called Lochran Basin, or Edinburgh Quay if you will. You can see a bridge behind me, the Leamington Lift Bridge. It's the only hydraulically powered bridge on the Union Canal, but this isn't its original location. It was a bit further behind me situated by two basins, one called Port Hopetoun, which serviced the passenger trade, the passenger terminal, and Port Hamilton, which serviced all the coal coming in and out along the canal. The basins were infilled in the 1920s as the canal started to fall into decline. Now, a bit of research in our archives turned up a little interesting snippet, a map, or a plan I should say, from the 1920s, which showed a manure weighing machine, which was just behind me. You may ask, why are we weighing manure? Well, remember that there was a lot of horse-drawn carts about at the time, and the St Cuthbert's Cooperative had a dairy just next to us. So all of that dung, all of that manure material was collected up and would be put on the empty barges and taken out into the fields, the agricultural fields, as fertiliser. In recognition of the historical importance of this bridge, it too has been awarded a red wheel. I hope you've enjoyed the journey through the history of the Union Canal as much as I have. Come and experience its wonders for yourself. Goodbye and good luck.